If you're considering going to Egypt soon, there may be some things you're still unsure about, like is it safe? How's the internet? Should I use tours? These are all questions I had myself, but the good news is I just returned from Egypt and can answer all of them for you. So let's get into it. Because of everything going on in the world and because of Egypt's proximity to some other countries, the number one question everyone is asking is it safe to travel to Egypt in 2024? And the answer is a resounding yes. I visited Dahab in the Sinai Peninsula while I was there, and of course that was a little bit of a hassle because there were lots and lots of military checkpoints, so we did have to stop sometimes to get out of the van, show them our bags and things like that. But did I ever feel unsafe traveling around Egypt? Absolutely not. I may have felt annoyed by all the insistent salesmen and hassling, but I really never felt like I was in danger in Egypt. Because the country does really rely a lot on tourism, the government will want to make sure that all the tourists stay safe. But because of recent events, of course, the people of Egypt have been struggling to get by, especially during the tourist season, so I would advise you not to cancel your trip to Egypt. Another question people ask a lot is about the visa. Now, I researched online and I saw different answers in different places. I thought that maybe I would be able to pay the visa with a credit card. As far as I know, if you arrive in Cairo, you must pay it in cash. Just get a visa on arrival. It's the easiest option. There is some way to get it online, but it sounds like it's much more of a hassle, so don't even bother. Bring $25 in exact change because there's a chance they won't have change. So if you need to get money out, there are plenty of ATMs where you can do that there. And if it's not exact change, you can just buy a water or something and make sure it's exact change to get your visa on arrival. Now I'm going to talk a little about everyone's favorite subject, the money. And in Egypt, it's all about the cash. So make sure you always have Egyptian pounds on you. And that will be especially important for going to the bathroom. We're going to talk more about that later. Another reason you might want to have US dollars on you is because you can exchange your money on the black market while in Egypt. And that actually sounds much more complicated than it actually is, because as you're walking down the street, a lot of people will offer that service to you as it benefits both parties. Full disclosure, it doesn't do wonders for their economy, but I actually did utilize that service myself. What we did was deposit money in someone's Wise account, and then they took out the money at an ATM and gave us Egyptian pounds in cash. And this is not a sponsored video, but if you want to open an account with Wise, which I use all over the world and it benefits me greatly, I will leave a link down below to that. In terms of credit and debit card, can you use that in some places in Egypt? Kind of, like you can use it at the supermarket, coffee shops, and restaurants mostly, not many other places apart from that. But most of the tourist sites in Egypt, like all of the temples, museums, and pyramids and things like that, they will even require you to pay with a credit card, so you need a credit card to visit these places. Another thing we almost were able to use credit cards for is buying bus tickets online, but none of our cards ever worked, so I guess you can't use it for that either. By the way, I traveled to Egypt with my good friend Nicki from the blog Nicki Posts Travel Stuff, and she wrote a very informative article on all of this, so you really don't need to be taking any notes. I'll just leave a link to it down below, and there you're going to find all of this information with very specific details. Okay, now let's talk about how much things cost in Egypt. Of course, most things in Egypt were incredibly affordable. As far as food goes, depending on how local you go, you can get a meal anywhere from $1 to $6. In terms of tourist attractions, I actually found a lot of them to be quite pricey and others not so much. Let me give you some examples. So the Great Pyramids of Giza and the museum, each of those were about $16. But you know, some of the more famous temples, especially the ones around Luxor, some of those were $25 entry, which I thought was a lot. But other things like a hot air balloon ride was only $55, which is pretty much half of what you pay in Cappadocia, Turkey. And just to give you an idea of what a private driver might cost, we had a driver take us from Luxor to Dendera to see a temple there and back. So that was a total of about 2 hours and we paid $65. Now, as for the local markets, I mean, that's really going to depend on your powers of negotiation. Of course, their first price is going to be extremely high because you're a tourist. What you can do is just initially cut that price by half, tell them you'll pay half of that price. And then just kind of negotiate until you're both happy. My strategy is to always figure out in US dollars how much would I pay for that item. Then convert that to Egyptian pounds and just never go above that price in Egyptian pounds. If he wants to go above that price, literally just walk away, and walking away is how you're going to get the best price in Egypt, no doubt. As soon as they see you're not interested, they're gonna try to give you that merchandise in any way possible. So sometimes you actually don't even want the merchandise and they're just gonna keep going lower and lower and lower until you're convinced to buy it. Now let's talk about tipping. In Egypt, you need to tip people for everything, and honestly, it's really annoying because you always have to have some sort of small cash with you. So of course you're tipping 10% at restaurants, but you're also tipping your guides, you're tipping your drivers, you're tipping the guy that puts your luggage onto the van or onto the bus. Yes, even him you are tipping. However, what's important to note is that at all of the tourist sites, people are going to try to offer you some sort of free information to get tips from you. Whether that be to show you the best wall to take a picture of, to show you the best pose. They may want to take a picture of you. They may want to tell you where your tour group is if you get lost from them, which actually happened to me. So basically just kindly refuse every time. It's going to happen a lot, and if you tip everyone, you're just going to go bankrupt. And honestly, that really annoyed me because at some of these sites, you're paying $25 to get in, and then you actually have to deal with these people inside of the sites as well. It's like you just can't get rid of the scammers in Egypt. That brings me to my next order of business, which is you can expect a headache in Egypt. Listen, one thing is for sure, Egypt is definitely not for everyone. Most of the time, it's really loud and overwhelming. It will test your patience in many ways, so you need to be prepared mentally. Honestly, while I was there, especially in Luxor, I got a real headache like every single day. As a foreigner, you just attract a lot of attention, and sometimes I didn't even want to leave my accommodation because I just couldn't deal with it any longer. The hassling really starts getting to you if you're there for a long time like we were, and honestly, I was just so relieved to fly out of that country. By the way, if you've made it this far into the video, my name is Art and I've been traveling the world for about 10 years now, and on my channel you're going to find all of the information you need to awaken your travel dreams. So if you want to see more videos like this one, considering subscribing so you don't miss them. Alright, let's get back to talking about bathrooms. So in Egypt you can expect to have to pay for the bathroom unless you're at a restaurant or something like that. They usually cost between 5 and 10 pounds, and they usually have no toilet paper. So it's actually a pretty good idea to have some hand sanitizer with you most of the time. And it's always good to have small bills or coins so you can actually pay to get in the bathrooms. That was actually really annoying because again, at some of these tourist sites, you've already paid $25 to get in. So why do I have to pay for the bathroom as well? Now let's talk about food and drinks. And this is something I was really unsure about. So let me see if I can answer all your questions. Honestly, I was very prepared to have food poisoning while in Egypt. So let me give you my first-hand experience on that. As for the tap water, you should never drink the tap water in Egypt unless you are boiling it. So maybe one or two accommodations that we stayed at had filters by the sink, and then of course you can drink the filtered water, but you can't drink the water that comes out of the sink. And don't expect there to be a filter in most of your accommodations. So yes, you do need to buy those gallons and gallons of water at your local store. They are affordable enough. That's something you just have to do. That said, I read a lot of stuff online about people like brushing their teeth with mineral water. You absolutely do not have to do that. I wasn't sick once in Egypt, and I use the tap water for brushing my teeth all the time. And I also did use the tap water to make coffee and tea. So if you're boiling the water, it's absolutely fine. As for the food, I really wasn't sure if the street food was going to be safe. I was a little scared, but honestly, that's probably what we ate the most. We were eating stuff off the street, especially falafel, every single day. And besides being absolutely delicious, it was also super affordable, so I definitely recommend doing that. And we definitely fell in love with this Egyptian breakfast food called ful, which is made out of fava beans. We were paying like $1 for it at our local shop in Cairo, and they just bring you tons and tons of food for $1. It's literally the best breakfast. Now here's an important one, alcohol. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to drink in Egypt at all. I was actually prepared to not drink for 23 days. I drank on some occasions in Egypt. At some restaurants you can find this large green bottle of beer they have called Stella. I guess that's probably the most common and affordable beer you'll find. They also have a beer called Sakara, which is actually a 10% beer. I only had that once in Dahab. And actually in Dahab is where you'll find most places that sell alcohol because it's a little more catered to Westerners. So it's possible to find, but definitely don't expect to find it everywhere. Here's another thing I also wasn't very sure about, and that is Uber. Would I be able to use it in Egypt? Turns out we only used Egypt once in the town of Hurghada. Other times we tried to use it and either the internet connection was not good enough or maybe there weren't enough drivers around. So it's definitely not something I would rely on, but it is possible to use, probably more commonly in Cairo. Honestly, I wouldn't bother trying to get an Uber from the airport. I would arrange some sort of transportation with my accommodation, someone that's waiting for you as soon as you get off the plane. That's definitely the easiest. It will save you a headache and it is pretty affordable as well. And by the way, the only time we did use Uber, the driver actually messaged us and asked if we could pay in cash. So as soon as he got there, we were like, okay, we can pay in cash, but we're going to cancel this ride. So we canceled the ride. He took us to where we needed to go and we just paid him in cash. As for the taxis, they're all around, so they're really easy to find, but you know how taxi drivers are all around the world. They're just kind of that mafia, so make sure to negotiate the prices before you get in. And they will try to give you a high price, of course, so as I said earlier, just cut that in half and negotiate until both of you are happy. Now let's talk about how to travel between cities in Egypt. There's a company called GoBus, and they were our go-to company for bus rides in Egypt, no pun intended. You can actually check their schedule on the website, which is pretty helpful, but as I mentioned before, we were never able to make any purchases on their websites with our credit cards. So most of the time we just asked an Egyptian to make the purchase for us, and we just paid them in cash. A lot of the time that same person can probably drive you to the bus station, or they know someone that can drive you. So the easiest way is to just arrange with that same person transportation to the bus station and for them to buy your tickets, and you just give them everything in cash. On the GoBus website, you will find two kinds of vehicles. The first one is the Super Go D, which is a large yellow bus. And the next one is called the Go Mini, which is like a small Sprinter van. You should always go for the Mini if it's available, the Sprinter van, because it's actually faster and more comfortable. As for trains, we ended up not taking any. We did look at prices from Luxor to Cairo, and we were definitely considering taking the train, but then we checked the flight prices and they were cheaper, so it didn't make sense. Never happened. You can, of course, get private drivers from one city to the other, but do expect to pay accordingly. For example, when we went from Cairo to Dahab, that cost about $11, but a private driver that we did quote would have cost us $145. So it is a huge difference. Should you use guides in Egypt? Isn't that the million-dollar question? Well, let me tell you this. When I travel, I'm usually not into guides. I like exploring by myself. But I'm really glad I used guides in some situations in Egypt, and here are a few reasons. The first one is the transport. Most of the tours do include accommodation already, so that makes it super efficient. That was especially true when an excellent tour company called We Know Egypt took us to all the relevant pyramid sites in and around Cairo in one day. That made it super easy to tick these places off the list. It was super fast and efficient, and they were extremely trustworthy and very affordable as well. In Luxor, we were actually glad that we used a guide as well, because it did include transportation, and he took us to 5 of the main sites around Luxor, and they're all kind of scattered around, so it's much easier to just have one person driving you to each of them. Another reason to get a guide is that when you're at sites like the Great Pyramids of Giza, there are tons of scammers and hawkers, and they will leave you at least a little more alone if you have a guide. Your guide will always kind of help to shoo them away as well. Lastly, of course, if you're like me and you love Egyptian history, well, having a guide is a real advantage, because at some of these places there maybe isn't information, or the translation into English is not great, so having a guide is really helpful. Now, the other side of the coin is that if you use a lot of guides, eventually you might get toured out, just like I did. Honestly, after a while, I just couldn't go on any more tours. I had had enough. So that's something to consider as well. In our experience, what I can say is that if the place was easy enough to get to on our own, like some sites in Luxor, like the Luxor Temple and the Karnak Temple, we just did that by ourselves. And if we felt like we needed to take a taxi or some sort of transport to the place, we usually got a guide. The next one is really important for me, which is, how is the internet in Egypt? Well, as an online teacher and a digital nomad, it was essential for me to know how strong the internet was in Egypt. And honestly, I went through tons and tons of forums, and before going to Egypt, I still wasn't sure. And maybe that's because the answer is, it depends. So for example, our first 2 stops were in Cairo and Dahab. and the internet there was actually fine, which made me think, wow, maybe this is gonna work out and I'm gonna be able to work during all of the 23 days. And that was definitely not the case. But yes, in Cairo and Dahab, it was fine. There was one blackout in Cairo, which meant, of course, no internet, but it only lasted for 30 minutes. So that's something you should be aware of. In other places like Hurghada and Luxor, well, the internet just kind of sucked. In Luxor, in fact, they have a city-wide blackout every single day, so you can expect to not have any internet for hours on end sometimes. So I was in Luxor for a while, maybe like 10 days, so I actually didn't work for the whole second part of my trip. At this point, you may be thinking, hey Art, why didn't you just get a big data plan? Well, that's definitely something I considered, but when we arrived in Egypt, we found out that Egypt does not work with eSIMs. And on the newer iPhones, as you may know, you can only have an eSIM. So to have data on the street, we had to get some data through Airalo, which in most countries works fine, but in Egypt, it's connected to the Orange network, and the Orange network kind of sucks. So I was not about to try to use Airalo or Orange for teaching purposes. So I guess my solution would be this. If you absolutely do need good internet all of the time in Egypt, the best thing you can try is getting one of those like portable modems at Vodafone. They cost about $28, and that should give you enough data for the month. It's also important to note that you cannot see everything in Egypt. We definitely skipped through some places. It would take a lifetime to explore everything that Egypt has to offer. I've seen some people online talking about 7-day itineraries and seven different stops and cities in Egypt. That is just absurd. Don't listen to any of that. I mean, is it physically possible? Yes, of course it is, but it would be extremely tiring. Egypt is a huge country, and going from one place to the next requires all sorts of logistics and mental energy. I would not recommend doing that. As I mentioned, we were there for 23 days, and we skipped over places I really did want to see, like Siwa Oasis, Alexandria, Aswan, and Abu Simbel. And I was still extremely tired by the end of it. So the best advice I can give you is determine your priorities and give yourself enough time in each location. Think about how much you also will need to relax after some of these trips. I know it would be extremely helpful for you to have an exact budget for your next trip to Egypt, so I've decided to make my next video showcase exactly how much I spent during my 23 days there. So just click on the video that's on your screen and I'll walk you through it in 3, 2, 1.